All right, now before we really get tearing into the wonderful world of Photoshop and start, digging into all the different commands and options and tools that we have available here inside Photoshop, I think what would be extremely important is to take a moment and explain some of the fundamentals here with you, some of the image fundamentals. So this is sort of beyond Photoshop. It's not just related to Photoshop, but I want you to understand that Photoshop is what we would refer to as a raster image editor. Now, what does that mean, a raster image editor? Well, I want to talk about the two different kinds of graphics that we have available to us whenever we're working in the wonderful world of graphics. We have raster graphics and we have vector graphics. Maybe you've heard of these terms before, I don't know. But for the time being, forget about JPEGs and forget about TIFFs and forget about EPSs and all this kind of crazy stuff. Forget about all the file formats and let's just focus on raster and vector, and I'm sure by the end of this exercise it'll make perfect sense here for you. So I'm here inside Photoshop. I've launched Photoshop and I went and opened up a photograph of a very drafty barn, as you can see here. And as I say, Photoshop is our raster image editor. What does that mean? Well, a raster graphic is a graphic that's made up of tiny blocks of color called pixels. I'm sure you've heard of pixels before. So they're just, imagine like tiny Lego bricks or a mosaic, and they all come together to form what appears to be a nice smooth image, like a drafty barn, for example. So if I zoom in on this graphic, and don't worry about this for yourself. I haven't talked about how to zoom and different zooming techniques in Photoshop yet. We'll get to that. If you just want to kind of kick back and watch the show for a moment, as I zoom in, you can start to make out these pixels. And now I can start to see pixels here in the barn boards. So they're actually not barn boards. It's just a mosaic tile work of colored blocks that look like barn boards, if that makes sense. These are pixels, right? That's the idea. The closer I zoom in, the more prominent, the more pronounced these pixels are. If I start zooming out, you can see the pixels seem to blur together. And that's actually the human eye, which is just blending all of these blocks of color together to give the illusion of a smooth looking image, right? So that's really what raster graphics are all about. Now, let me jump over to the world of vector graphics for a moment. So vector graphics, it's sort of like the opposite of raster graphics. I happen to have Adobe Illustrator open here in the background. I'll just flip over to Illustrator. Now, if you haven't worked with Illustrator before, I love Illustrator. You can really do some amazing things. Illustrator is what we would refer to as a vector image editor. Well, what's the difference? Well, rather than using tiny blocks of color, this mosaic tile work to create a graphic or to create a cartoon like this cartoon robot, what it does instead is a vector graphic is going to create a graphic out of mathematical lines and curves and shapes and things like this. Now, don't worry, you don't have to break out a scientific calculator to create a shape. It's going to handle all the math for you. But if I start to zoom in on this cartoon here, you'll notice that the lines, like the black outline and the color inside and all the rest of it, remains nice and smooth, even when I zoom in super close on this image here. If I start to pan around inside this image, you can see these lines are always going to be nice and smooth and clean. That's the mathematical aspect, if you will, to a vector graphic. That's how it works. Okay, so I hope this is happening for you. Let's flip over to Photoshop once again. Now, I'll give you some examples of some raster graphics here. A photograph is a perfect example of a raster graphic. This was a photograph that I took with my digital camera, and digital cameras are always measured, their qualities are always measured using megapixels, right? Mega meaning millions of pixels. That's the idea there. Things like scans, anything you would scan into your computer, a lot of the content that we see when we're surfing around on the web, graphically anyway, those are all examples of raster graphics. Now, what are some examples of some vector graphics? I'll flip back over to Illustrator here. Well, cartoons are a great example. What I would call line art, if you've seen some blueprints or schematics, things like this. Charts, text is a killer example of a vector graphic. If you've ever used text in any application, you've worked with vector graphics, believe it or not. So I hope that makes sense for you. Now, raster graphics are what are referred to as resolution dependent. What that means is if I take my photograph of my barn here and I try to make it bigger, we'll talk about resizing in just a little while. What happens is the image actually starts to break down. It starts to pixelate because really I'm asking my software, Photoshop, to make up image out of nothing. Imagine if I were to take a 5:7 photograph and increase it to an 8:10. Well, where is it going to get that extra information from? It's got to make it up. That's a process called interpolation or resampling. We'll talk about that. So raster graphics are resolution dependent, and what's extremely cool is vector graphics are what are referred to as resolution independent. So I could take this cartoon robot and I could make him as big or as small as I wanted to. And because he's all based on math, he's going to scale proportionately. He's never going to lose any quality, which is amazing. So theoretically, I could create a poster that would fit on my living room wall out of this robot cartoon if I wanted to. Whereas again, back in Photoshop, if I increase the size of this photograph, then I run the risk of losing quality. Okay, last but not least, how about some file formats? I told you to forget about JPEGs and TIFFs and all that kind of stuff. Well, let's talk about file formats real quick here. Here's really quickly some raster file formats for you. The native Photoshop file format, .psd, that's obviously a raster file format. JPEGs are raster, GIFs, GIF, those are raster, TIFFs, and sometimes PDFs are also raster graphics as well. There's another file format as well called PNG or PNG files. Those are raster graphics as well. Over on the vector side, we have Adobe Illustrator's native file format, .ai. PDFs can sometimes be vector as well, and Flash files are also vector. Now, you might use some other programs, maybe like AutoCAD or CorelDRAW. Those are also going to be vector file formats. So there you go. There's a load of information about raster graphics and vector graphics, and I hope it sets the tone for the rest of our time together, because now we understand exactly what we're working with here inside Photoshop. We know we're working with pixels, we know we're working with resolution dependent files, and so on.